Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. Chasca is the newest DPS character in Genshin Impact. In this ultimate guide video, you'll learn everything you need to know about Chasca. Chasca is a powerful and unique bow-wielding animo DPS character, and despite being a bow-wielding animo DPS character, she uses a giant revolver and primarily deals non-animo damage. Anyway, we ain't got time for shenanigans since these full guide videos are always super packed, so let's hop right into it, right after I tell you what's in this video, which includes her kit, artifacts and stats, weapons, teams, constellations, and finally my opinion on Chasca. Alright, those of you that are particularly astute might notice that this next kit section is from my Constellation 0 Chasca showcase. So if you've already seen that and don't need it, well, feel free to skip ahead. There are timestamps down below. But yeah, I figured since the editing was pretty good for that section, I'll just reuse it here in this video. Let's kick things off with Chasca's normal bow attacks. They're just as useless as expected, so let's ride on over to her elemental skill, Spirit Rain's Shadow Hunt. Chasca mounts her Soul Sniper Ritual Staff, where she enters Nightsoul state and has two attacking options. Lightly tapping the attack button will politely request her enemies to stop existing. Or you can load up some serious firepower with her charged attacks to actually assist your enemies to stop existing. For every Pyro, Electro, Cryo, and Hydro, or Petch for short, character in her party, she'll load one shining Shadow Hunt shell in slots 4, 5, and 6. The order of the elements of the 4th, 5th, and 6th shells are random, but they'll always be based on the Petch elements in your party. As for the third shell loaded, it's based on this passive, which is a lot of funny words to say that it picks a random element from your team. And if you have 3 different Petch elements on your team, it will never be an animo shell. Shells are fired in the order of last in, first out. This passive also increases the amount of damage her shining Petch shells do based on the number of Petch characters on your team, with 1, 2, and 3 Petch elements increasing shining shell damage by 15, 35, and 65% respectively. Okay, so after extensive testing, this 15%, 35%, and 65% actually goes into the bonus damage multiplier, the same multiplier as in the Elemental Goblet, which is still quite good and still a very solid passive. Without any teammates, the higher rate of Petch bullets plus bonus damage on the Petch shots leads to around a 51% increase in the raw damage for Chasca's charged shots. Now these numbers don't include the additional damage dealt by elemental reactions as well, which makes up a non-negligible amount of her damage. However, this gap will close significantly if we add team bonus damage buffs like Furina's Elemental Burst. As we can see, by harnessing the power of the rainbow, she's able to blast her shining loads a total of 4 times with a single mount of her revolver. As for multi-target, this is where her DPS actually suffers, as it appears that the shells she fires targets different enemies, and also she needs to have an enemy in her reticle to actually load shells. So similar to Milani and Kanish, if you mess up, miss aim, or the enemy moves out of your aiming zone, then Chasca could end up doing a lot less damage, potentially only blasting 3 loads or perhaps just 2 loads, depending on how bad of a situation she's in. As for her interrupt resistance, supposedly she has some more of it, but honestly, unlike a certain hat, enemies struggle to hit her since she seems to be flying a bit higher than I expected. And she has great mobility, allowing her to dodge attacks just by moving left and right. As for which shells apply an element, from what I can tell, the first shell that comes out and the third shell that comes out each apply a Petch element, and the 5th shell that comes out applies animo. In total, a single fully charged charge shot can cause up to 3 elemental applications. This means that yes, she can vape, yes, she can melt, yes, she can do all of the many Petch elemental reactions. Anyway, here are a bunch of additional useful parameters for her elemental skill. She generates, I believe, 5 animal particles a single time during her Nightsoul state when her charged attack hits an enemy. The damage from her charged shots counts as charged attack damage, and her skill's 6.5 second cooldown begins after it ends. And up next, we have her Elemental Burst. Her Elemental Burst shoots an initial extremely long-ranged Animo Blast, which deals an initial instance of Animo damage on impact and splits off into 6 Soul Seeker shells. For each Petch character in her party, 2 of these Soul Seeker shells will convert to Radiant Soul Seeker shells, which are infused with the corresponding element and deal more damage. And finally, we have her Nightsoul Burst passive, which essentially just fires off a free, slightly stronger Shining Shell from her elemental skill when a Nightsoul Burst is triggered. While nice, this is not too impactful to her kit, and you'll typically see this once, maybe twice in a rotation. Unfortunately, this Nightsoul Burst can actually mess with a lot of desired rotations, like for example activating the Cinder City buff with Auroron, ironically giving Chasca an RNG chance to actually activate the Cinder City's buff for the Pyro element. However, on occasion, it can do some additional non-negligible damage. Anyway, as we've been tragically witnessing, our poor sentient salad friend couldn't even survive a couple of pumps from Chasca's BBC, aka her big beautiful cannon. Let's bring this rodeo to our 1 million hit point robot chicken friend instead. Now for this showcase, I decided to swap to the Hamayumi bow, which is another very free-to-play friendly bow that allows her to do significantly more charge attack damage with a bit more restrictions in terms of when she can use her burst. The Hamayumi actually barely allowed Chasca to 2-cycle our robot chicken friend, which is a pretty admirable performance, with Chasca dealing around 450-ish thousand damage over her infusion window. Overall, a very solid single target DPS performance. So quick disclaimer, Chasca's calculations will vary significantly depending on her team composition. For most of the calculations in this video, I used Bennett, Furina, and Auroron as her teammates. So please take this with a giant grain of salt and use it as general recommendations, as again, her team compositions definitely affect a lot of stuff. Up next, it's Chasca's artifacts. For most situations, just use the Obsidian Codex. It's the best no-nonsense set for her that provides 15% bonus damage and 40% crit rate. Another set that performs similarly if you use her with Furina is the Marichasi Hunter. While this is the case, I still do recommend farming the Obsidian Codex since, well, it's a bit better and you're farming the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City. Now, another non-copium artifact set is the Shimenawa's Reminiscence. The Shimenawa's has competitive charged attack damage, although it makes her burst unlikely to be usable past the first rotation. As such, I've removed the burst from the full rotation calcs. Another thing going for the Shimenawa's is that it's a great option if you plan to use high crit rate bows like the Polar Star and Hunter's Path. However, for any non-crit rate bow, overall I recommend the Obsidian Codex. The next most usable set is the 4-piece Wanderer's Troop, which is an ice set and a reasonable temporary artifact set as you farm for the Obsidian Codex. Interestingly, the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City and the Viridescent Veneer are usable options which can also potentially boost her teammates' damage. Although the buffs provided by these sets are a bit inconsistent due to the RNG nature of Chasca's reactions, so do keep that in mind. And finally, just for the memes, I calculated a full Elemental Mastery Gilded Dreams build, and the damage is absolutely horrible, and this is no surprise since her transformative reaction damage makes up just around 2.7% of her damage output with this team. Despite knowing all this though, I still calc the Gilded Dreams for some reason, I think to make a funny point, but it's not really that funny in retrospect. Moving on, let's talk about main stats and substats. I made some assumptions for her damage distribution with this team. With Furina on her team, you're very likely to be vaping some of Chasca's pyro damage, hence why pyro damage makes up the plurality of her damage. So I tried slapping on a pyro goblet, and it still underperforms in comparison to an attack percent goblet. Perhaps with certain teams and setups, an elemental goblet can be better, but generally speaking, attack percent goblet is the way to go. Alright, and an attack percent timepiece, and generally a crit damage circlet for the other pieces is recommended. As for energy recharge, while her burst does make up a non-negligible amount of her damage output, I don't recommend trying to get enough energy recharge to get it up every time at the cost of other stats, which for most of her teams is just a ton of energy recharge, so it's typically not even worth it. As for substats, it's the usual crit rate and attack percent. Now interestingly, because the team of Bennett plus Furina plus some Electro character that can buff her a bit that I calced for lacks any Elemental Mastery bonuses, Elemental Mastery is somewhat competitive, so getting a few EM rolls here and there is reasonable as well. Alright, let's go through Chasca's weapon options, starting with her signature weapon, which obviously is just going to be her best option. It's essentially tailor-made for her and definitely outperforms her other options, being roughly 25 or so to 30% better than her free-to-play friendly options, at least in a full team setting. Speaking of which, these calcs were done with full team buffs in mind. In this case, we are assuming a Constellation 0 Furina, a Sapwood Blade Constellation 6 Bennett, and a Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City Auroron, just for these team calcs because I had to pick some type of baseline and this is the one that I ended up going with. So yeah. Now the next best option in my opinion is likely the Aqua Simulacra, where if you're close to the enemy, which actually can be a bit of an issue for Chasca, then it's going to do around 87.3% of the damage that her signature weapon does. And after that, we have some other stat sticks, including the First Great Magic as well as the Thundering Pulse. Both of these are very reasonable 5-star stat sticks. However, when it comes to some of the other stat sticks like the Skyward Harp, now you're hitting 86.3 base crit rate thanks to the crit rate substats on the Skyward Harp, which definitely presents, well, an obvious issue, needless to say, because now you can only roll a very few amount of substats when it comes to actually being able to utilize the Skyward Harp. Afterwards, the Amos bow, for the most part, most of its passive isn't really usable by Chasca, because I believe her shots don't count as having projectile firing speed. So therefore, Chasca can't really benefit that much from the passive that the Amos bow provides. But of course, the Amos bow is a reasonable stat stick with high base attack and a lot of attack percent and a little bit of bonus damage as well. Now up next, we have the Polar Star, which is pretty interesting. And while Chasca can actually utilize a decent number of stacks on the Polar Star, the issue with it is that you are now at 97.3% base crit rate. However, you can also use the Shimenao's Reminiscence with this, so do keep that in mind that you do have that as an option where the Polar Star's crit rate won't really go to waste. Now up next, we have the Battle Pass weapon Scion of the Blazing Sun, and very similar to the Polar Star as well as the Skyward Harp or any other bow with a lot of crit rate, you're going to be over-critting very quickly, with this one putting you at 82.6% crit rate. It is definitely noticeably lower than the others, so you do have a few more crit rate rolls to go into. And when it comes to this weapon, really, you know, with most Battle Pass weapons, you definitely want to try to refine them a bit in order for them to really be worth the money, in my opinion. So after that, we have the range gauge, which admittingly still needs more testing, and I haven't really done any testing on live with this weapon. And if there are a lot of healing issues with this thing, it could definitely be very restrictive. Like, for example, I think Bennett typically only heals her one time near the beginning of the rotation, and then, you know, maybe once throughout it. So, but yeah, in theory, if you're able to actually get 3 stacks via healing, then the range gauge might be a decent option. Now up next, this is one of the better free-to-play options. It is the Song of Stillness at Refinement 5. We can see here that the full rotation as well as the individual charge shots deal around 79% of the damage, and this makes it a great option with Furina. Up next, we have the Hamayumi, and I think I'm actually going to bump the rating up of the Hamayumi to 3 stars, because the reason is you can use your burst at the very end, like perhaps after 1 or 2 rotations, in order to end a fight with the burst, and therefore getting, you know, even more damage than this rotation implies. Because we can see that out of the free-to-play options, whether it's the Song of Stillness, the Hamayumi, or the Chainbreaker, she does the most charge attack damage, which is the most important part of her kit. So the Hamayumi is nice, especially if you don't really plan to use her burst much. One more thing about the Hamayumi is that in these calcs, I removed the burst from the rotation, which is why the damage seems pretty low. But still, you know, I didn't calc it if you use the burst at the end of the rotation versus, let's say, you just didn't use the burst at all. So anyway, up next we have the Chainbreaker, whose buffs are a bit diluted because of the attack percent being being one of the major buffs from this thing, and Bennett obviously providing a ton of attack, and we are assuming Bennett buffs in these calcs because I had to, pick one team to do the calcs on. So in terms of the rankings, we have her signature weapon, then the Aqua Simulacra, then pretty much all the other 5-star stat sticks. And then for the free-to-plays, we have the Song of Stillness, Hamayumi, and Chainbreaker, each with their own pros and cons. So honestly, if you use her with Fiorina, I would go with the Song of Stillness. If you want kind of a more future-proof one, I would go with the Chainbreaker in case you don't want to use Fiorina with her. And if you just want to really focus on charge attack damage, of course, the Hamayumi is a decent option as well. Alright, let's go through some teams for Chasca, with one of my personal favorites being this team with Bennett, Fiorina, and Auroron, as these three characters can all significantly boost Chasca's damage output, with Auroron being able to use the Cinder City, as well as Bennett and Fiorina doing Bennett-Fiorina things, just providing the massive buffs that they generally provide. A great team overall, I personally highly recommend it. Up next, we have a Vape and Vapor team where you have 2 Pyros as well as 1 Hydro, like a Fiorina, in particular, actually basically just Fiorina. In this case, the reason why this team works, even though you are sacrificing a bit of damage on her first passive, is because you do get Pyro Resonance and more of your damage will vape, thanks to the fact that you only have Pyro and Electro to deal with, and therefore more Pyro shells and more Hydro shells. Did I say Electro? If I did, I meant Hydro. And you are going to be able to vape a bit more than, for example, in the previous team. And of course, we can just swap out certain characters for other elements, like there's no reason why Charlotte can't work here. Charlotte can be a good Thrilling Tales of the Dragon Slayer buffer, where she can just, obviously just toss that to Chasca, as well as throw on something like the Tenacity of the Millilith or whatever, in order to provide some additional buffs as well. And for that matter, you can even have a moral support character like Lisa if you really want to, who can just literally sit there and not do anything. And instead you can use a character like Barbara to have the Thrilling Tales buff. And funnily enough, Barbara's Constellation 4 will Constellation 2 will actually provide 15% additional Hydro damage bonus. So in a way, it's actually not too copium for you to use Barbara here as well. And finally, there's no reason why you can't slap on, for example, double Pyro with Cryo. In this case, a Cryo buffer like Shenhe. Now you can melt some damage here and there, especially the big damage numbers that Shenhe will provide for the Cryo shells. Of course, similar problem to the previous double Pyro Hydro is that you do have less shells, but you will also have a higher rate of melting. In this case, the Cryo shells, you're probably not really going to be melting any of the damage on the Pyro side, so there's that to keep in mind. But yeah, basically just mix and match the patch elements as needed. And you can see though, however, I do recommend Bennett pretty much always with Chasca. Although, maybe that'll change, and maybe I'm overvaluing Bennett a bit, but yeah, you'll probably be fine without Bennett as well. It's just that Bennett provides so many buffs and so much damage for Chasca that it's kind of hard to not utilize him. So since Chasca is compatible with literally all patch element characters, I decided to actually make a list for each element as well as what each character can roughly provide for Chasca. And let's go through Pyro first. Obviously, Bennett is going to be one of the best characters for obvious reasons. Healing plus a ton of attack plus potential Freedom Sorn, as well as, many other things like Noblesse and yeah, but some circle impact issues. But as you can see, Chasca can just kind of strafe around and dodge stuff. Now, the next best character overall is probably Xiangling, because she can provide, a decent amount of Pyro damage via Pyro bonus damage, as well as Pyro resistance shred, and finally, even if you want to pick up Guoba's chili pepper. And of course, there is her own personal damage, which is definitely substantial. After that, when it comes to Pyro options, we're starting to get to much less impactful options, but probably one of the better ones is Yanfei with her shield at, I believe, Constellation 4, as well as the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. You can definitely use her as a budget option if you do need shielding and Thrilling Tales. And after that, probably Klee, because Klee can offer the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, and there are actually some people that do have Constellation 2 Klee, and if you do have Constellation 2 Klee, I would actually bump her rating up, perhaps a star or two. And yeah, for the defense shred, obviously. After that, you have Dea for tenacity, as well as just offering some tankiness. And, you know, we're hitting into like 2 stars and under rating. So yeah, you can see the rest of the list here. Some of these characters will get better if you have like more whale stuff. Like for example, Amber with Elegy. She can definitely be bumped up if you do have those things, but of course, you know, we're talking about some significant investments. Now the next element is Hydro, and you know, we still have very few Hydro characters in comparison to some of the other elements, but Furina, no question about it, probably one of her best, if not the best teammates for Chasca. Sub DPS, bonus damage, Key of Cognizant, heck, even the Freedom Sword in some situations if you want. This character does it all, and she even reduces your health for the Marichasi Hunter if you do want to go that route. And finally, we have Mona, a significant downgrade from Furina because, you know, she doesn't really do as much damage unless you really build her for nuke damage or something wild like that. And Thrilling Tales as well as Tenacity, so she is a pretty reasonable budget replacement for Furina. Of course, she does take a significant amount of field time. Her buffs don't last very long, so she does have her drawbacks. And then we have Barbara, who is kind of a even more budget alternative than Mona. But what's interesting about Barbara is she takes almost no field time and has, you know, additional Hydro application if you hug the enemy. Thrilling Tales, a very low budget character. So, you know, personally, I think between the two of them, when I used them, they felt very similar because, you know, Barbara, lower field time and stuff like that. So next character is Yelan. Now, Yelan, while unfortunately not really being able to utilize her coordinated attack, still provides a bunch of bonus damage, and she can use the Elegy. And in fact, you know, you can still use her skill here and there to do some damage, generate particles, whatever. Typical Yelan stuff, minus all the coordinated attack damage. But Yelan is a pretty good character regardless, and the bonus damage is non-negligible that she provides. Still, 2.5 star rating, not the best option, but a usable option. Up next, we have Siegeween. Well, healing, Elegy, tenacity, you know the drill with her, except if you do have her Constellation 2, this is when she can definitely be bumped at least 1, maybe 2 stars to 3.5 stars, I'd say. Perhaps even, you know, 4 stars. She's very low field time if you do have her Constellation 2. But yeah. Now, Milani, you might be surprised to see on this list, but you can absolutely use Milani in between some of Chasca's times, or just to run some dual DPS setups, because all Milani really needs to do a lot of damage is a Pyro character. Obviously, she prefers being able to swirl and a bunch of other stuff, but you can still squeeze out some reasonable damage here and there, especially as you get into whale level investment territories. Then Milani is definitely going to be an incredible teammate for Chasca. But at lower investments, you can see here I've just put her as a nuker role and just 1.5 stars. Finally, we have Neela, who works very similarly to Milani. She can just be used as a quick nuke, as well as to just exist as a Hydro character and use the key, or perhaps Freedom Sword as well, I guess, but mainly the Key of Cognizant. Now, next element is Electro, and actually there's fewer Electro characters than I thought, but we have Auroron. Now, out of the Electro characters, I don't really think any of them deserve a 5-star rating, but Auroron is probably one of the better ones with the Cinder City, as well as his Constellation 6's 30% attack buff. Next option, in my opinion, is probably Yai Miko, because she definitely does some non-negligible damage. She can trigger some reactions herself, like Overload, Electrocharge, the good stuff. And yeah, I guess if you really want, you can throw Thrilling Tales on her for her to not really do any damage and to literally just be a Thrilling Tales bot. But I personally think that's kind of a waste. Her damage is reasonable. And up next, after that, we actually have Kujo Sara, whose Constellation 6 can provide 60% crit damage to Chasca's electro damage output. However, she's only buffing a very small fraction of the damage, and her attack buff doesn't really last through the entire duration, but Kujo Sara is definitely a usable option. Up next, we have Fischl, who is a reasonable sub DPS as well as Elegy holder. Now, of course, without Dendro, Fischl's lack of aggravate doesn't do nearly as much damage. However, she can still trigger a bunch of the random electro reactions that you are also familiar with. Up next, we have Beidou. Now, because Chasca's frequency of attack isn't that high, so she doesn't really get that much sub DPS from Beidou, but still, Beidou can be used, and she can be used as a kind of a tankiness type of character because she offers interrupt resistance as well as shield, although in my opinion it's not too valuable with Chasca because Chasca does dodge stuff pretty well. Now, up next, we have Lisa, who can provide Thrilling Tales as well as Defense Shred, but if she's using the Thrilling Tales, that means she has severe energy issues, and if she's not using the Thrilling Tales, then then she only provides a defense strat. So, you know, she has a lot of issues, which is why I don't have her higher. But of course, you can just have her as a Thrilling Tales bot, as well as basically a one pump chump single use burst per fight type of character. And up next we have Raiden, who can run tenacity as well as just apply a lot of electro, and heck, you can even actually run her as just a quick nuker with the emblem of her face. Just do a quick swipe, do a bunch of damage, and then get on out of there. Now the next element we have is Cryo. So Cryo is also similar in my opinion to Electro, where I don't really think there's a perfect Cryo teammate for Chasca currently. Perhaps that will change in the future. But first off, we have Shenhe, who just increases cryo damage by a lot. Then after that, we have Layla, who provides shield as well as her Constellation 4, adds additional damage. I believe it's her Constellation 4. Let me just double check really quick. So yeah, adds damage to the charge attack damage equal to 5% of Layla's max HP. Considering, you know, how many hits Chasca does, this definitely adds up. And she can also use the key of Kajnisa, although she's not a very reliable activator of it, but you know, you sometimes can make it work. Up next, we have Charlotte, who provides healing, Thrilling Tales of the Dragon Slayer, as well as reasonable tenacity uptime. And you know, Charlotte is just a usable character. She also has decent cryo application for what it's worth. And after that, probably we have Diona, who provides shield as well as 200 elemental mastery via her Constellation 6, and she also provides the Elegy of the End buff, which is all right. Now Ayaka is a bit low if you don't have her at Constellation 4, but she can definitely be used as just a quick nuker. Just, you know, use her burst maybe every other or third rotation and exist as a cryo character. Finally, if you do have her Constellation 4, this is when I would actually bump her to arguably the best teammate for Chasca, because at Constellation 4, Ayaka will definitely do some very, very serious damage. But yeah, you know, typical Ayaka stuff. And finally, we have Rosaria, who can operate as basically a sub DPS, provides a bit of crit rate. And then we have Kaya, who if you do have the Freedom Sword, he becomes much more usable, but you know, his damage now to haste is not that much, but yes, he still can be a sub DPS. And finally, we have Chi-Chi, who provides healing, tenacity, and if you do have the Freedom Sword, as well as the key of Kajni Sut buffs, if you want to, you know, linger her on the field for a little bit longer to get those buffs. So yeah, that covers all the characters that I think are worth running. Now, I most certainly missed some characters as well as some of their utility, because, you know, I'm trying to keep this video under 1,000,000 minutes long. So let me know if I missed anything notable and who you actually want to use as pet support characters for Chasca. Up next, we have Chasca's Constellations and investment priority. Since this part of the video always has the worst retention, here is Chasca enforcing the peace. Chasca's Constellation 1 is interesting as it partially alleviates Chasca's elemental restrictions. To my understanding, the third bullet will now have a 100% conversion rate with 2 different Petch elements. On top of that, the second shell will be automatically converted to a shiny Petch shell, and if you replace one of the Petch characters with a Geo or Anemo character, you'll still be able to do roughly the same amount of damage as a Rainbow Petch team in comparison to her at Constellation 0, which improves her team building. So basically, Constellation 1 allows you to use a Geo buffer like Shilanin as an example. Chasca's Constellation 2 is the next step to further alleviate Chasca's elemental restrictions, where having 2 elements will grant her the full 65% multiplier. And it also deals an extra shining Petch shells worth of damage with a 400% multiplier that supposedly has higher AoE, although honestly this needs more testing. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if this is affected by the 65% multiplier or what its ICD is, so I took the conservative route of it not being affected by the 65% multiplier and not applying the element, and as such, this constellation could be better than expected. Still though, it's already calcing extremely well and looks to be a great constellation. Constellation 3 adds 3 levels to her skill, which is nice. Constellation 4 and 5 improves her burst a bit and aren't very great. Constellation 6 appears to be completely busted, adding some instant charge shots with crit damage as well. These calcs look a bit comical with how much more damage she might do, but by C6R5, she's going to be doing a ton more damage than at Constellation 0 R0, which already does a pretty good amount of damage. Now, if you were to ask me, should you go for Refinement 1 or Constellation 1? Personally, I would go for her signature weapon overall before Constellation 1. However, if you really want to use her with Shilanin or perhaps another Geo or Anemo or Dendro character, then Constellation 1 is the way to go. It also depends on what weapon you have for her. For example, if you want to use the Aqua Simulacra on her, then Constellation 1 is likely going to be more valuable for her. And finally, if you do want to invest a bit further into that, like for example 2 additional rolls worth of stuff, then I would personally go for her Constellation 2 before C1R1, if that makes any sense. So yeah, it's a matter of preference as always when it comes to investment priority. So what do I think about Chasca? Well, she's got that modern Natlin levels of DPS with the catch of the Natlin levels of unwieldiness. Yes, she does a ton of damage, but you better be comfortable with the charge shot gameplay style. So definitely keep this in mind, especially if you're on mobile, as I personally struggle a lot when using charge shots on mobile. Also, unlike other charge shot characters, Chasca has more restrictions by needing to have an enemy actually be in her reticle to load her shells, and she can't be swapped on and off during her Nightsoul state, and therefore has a time frame for her to actually do her DPS, and she doesn't have the greatest AoE. So yeah, big fun damage with lots of shiny numbers, but she has some additional restrictions. Overall, Chasca is a very powerful character if you're fine with these conditions. Let me know what you think about Chasca and if I missed anything down in the comments below. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Went to Lose, signing out.